The carriage rattled up the narrow mountain path, each turn disappearing into thick sheets of gray mist. Elise kept her hands clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. She stared at the passing pine trees, their wet branches clawing at the windows like desperate fingers. She carried only one suitcase, thin dresses, a worn shawl, a small book of poems she hardly dared to open these days. When she had left the village at dawn, her aunt had pressed her hand tightly and whispered, "Stay quiet, obey, return when you can." Now the words clung to her ribs like iron weights. At the final curve, the villa emerged from the fog. It loomed above the valley, all sharp lines and steep roofs, its dark stones glistening with rain. A single lantern flickered at the entrance, the weak flame swallowed by the endless mist. The carriage stopped abruptly. The driver, a silent man with a lined face, jumped down and opened the door without a word. Elise stepped onto the wet gravel, her thin shoes soaking through instantly. She looked up at the tall front door. It opened slowly, and a man stepped into the frame. He was tall, thin, dressed in a dark coat buttoned all the way to his throat. His hair, black and slicked back, made his face seem longer, more severe. He watched her for a long moment, his eyes cold and sharp. Then he stepped aside, wordlessly gesturing her in. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something older. Mildew, perhaps, or something Elise didn't want to name. The hallway stretched long and narrow, lined with portraits of unsmiling ancestors. Each face seemed to judge her, their eyes following her movements. Mr. Harrow, she guessed this was his name, took her suitcase and carried it as if it weighed nothing. She followed him, her footsteps muffled against the worn rugs. They reached a narrow staircase. He turned to her finally. His voice was deep, almost a growl. "You will be shown to your room. You will not wander. The east wing is forbidden, you understand?" Elise swallowed hard, nodding. Her voice failed her completely. He stared at her for another heartbeat before climbing the stairs. She followed, her fingers trailing lightly against the cold banister. At the top, he pushed open a door to a small, sparse room. A narrow bed, a chipped basin, a single wooden chair facing a barred window. He set her suitcase down and stepped back. "You begin work at dawn. Rest," he said, his words sharp and final. Then he left, closing the door behind him with a soft but final click. Elise stood still for a long moment, staring at the door. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might echo down the hallway. She stepped to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. Beyond the fog, the forest rose like a solid wall, dark and endless. Elise wrapped her arms around herself, the silence closing over her shoulders like a heavy shroud. She felt it already. This house was not simply lonely. It watched, it waited, and she had just stepped inside its grasp. Elise woke to the sound of heavy footsteps outside her door. The first pale light of dawn crept through the barred window, painting thin lines across the cold floor. Her breath formed small clouds as she sat up, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. A sharp knock rattled the door. Before she could answer, it swung open. Mr. Harrow stood in the frame, his dark coat buttoned to his chin, his eyes fixed on her with clinical coldness. "You will come with me," he said. "No greeting, no morning kindness, just an order." Elise scrambled out of bed, her bare feet numb against the freezing planks. She followed him into the hallway, her head bowed low. The portraits lining the walls felt even more oppressive in the morning light, their painted eyes following her as she moved. They descended the narrow staircase. The smell of damp wood and cold ash from the unlit fireplaces filled her lungs. In the kitchen, an old woman stood at a large wooden table, her back bent, hands working silently at a pile of root vegetables. Her gray hair was hidden under a dark scarf, and she didn't look up as they entered. "This is Marta," Mr. Harrow said flatly. "You will assist her. You clean the halls, tend to the fires, and prepare the meals. You do not enter the east wing. You do not leave your room at night. You do not speak unless spoken to. Do you understand?" Elise nodded quickly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Without another word, Mr. Harrow turned and left. The kitchen door shut behind him with a low thud that felt final, like the closing of a vault. Marta didn't move for a long moment. Then she slid a small paring knife across the table toward Elise without looking up. Elise hesitated, then stepped forward, her fingers closing around the handle. She began peeling carrots, her hands shaking. The sound of the blade scraping against the wooden board filled the silent room. Marta moved slowly, methodically, as though she had done the same task 1,000 times without pause. Occasionally, Elise risked a glance at Marta's face. Her eyes were sunken, her mouth set in a tight line. There was a tiredness there that went beyond age. Something broken, something that whispered of long years spent under quiet terror. When the basket was nearly empty, Marta finally looked at Elise. Her gaze was brief but heavy, as though warning her without words. Then she turned back to her work, her knife moving with soft, rhythmic precision. Elise's shoulders tensed as she bent over the vegetables. In that silence, she felt a new rule take root deep inside her ribs. This was a house where questions died before they were ever spoken. She finished the last carrot, her fingers red and raw. Marta took the basket from her hands without a word and carried it toward the stove. Elise stood alone by the table, the cold seeping into her bones. When Marta turned back, she motioned for Elise to follow her into the hallway. Elise obeyed, stepping back into the dim corridor lined with watchful portraits. The air felt thicker now, as if the walls themselves were pressing closer with every step. And somewhere deep inside, a cold certainty began to grow. She had entered a place where escape was not just forbidden. It was unthinkable. The hallway felt endless as Elise followed Marta. The old woman moved slowly, her shoulders hunched forward, her head lowered as if she were trying to disappear into the dark wood panels. Elise's eyes flicked nervously from portrait to portrait. Each face seemed to hold a private accusation. Marta stopped suddenly in front of a door near the end of the hallway. Without turning, she gestured for Elise to enter. Inside was a small utility room filled with buckets, rags, and an old broom propped against the wall. A faint smell of mold hung in the air. Marta pointed to a pile of cleaning supplies and then at the hallway behind them. Elise understood immediately. She picked up the bucket and rag, her fingers trembling slightly. Marta watched her for a moment longer before shuffling away without a sound, leaving Elise alone. She knelt on the floor and began scrubbing. The cold water bit into her skin, turning her fingers pale and numb. Each stroke felt deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if the act itself carried a meaning she couldn't yet see. As she worked, she heard a door creak open somewhere down the hall. Elise froze, her heart hammering. Slowly she turned her head and saw Mr. Harrow standing at the far end, partially hidden in the gloom. He didn't move toward her, didn't speak. He simply watched. Elise dropped her gaze instantly, pressing the rag harder into the floor. Minutes dragged into an hour. When she dared to look up again, he was gone. The empty space he had occupied seemed to radiate a silent warning. Elise leaned back on her heels, her breath shallow. She wiped her damp forehead with her sleeve and glanced at the door to the east wing. It stood closed, but something about its presence felt heavier than any locked gate. A sudden muffled noise caught her attention, a low thud, followed by a faint scraping, like furniture being dragged across the floor. Elise's blood ran cold. She strained her ears, trying to locate the sound, but it faded into silence as quickly as it had come. She turned back to her work, scrubbing harder now, as if she could erase the noise from her memory. Later, Marta returned and wordlessly took the bucket from her hands. She motioned toward the kitchen, and Elise followed obediently. Inside, Marta handed her a piece of dry bread and a small tin mug of weak tea. Elise ate standing by the stove, her eyes fixed on the curling steam. Marta sat across the room, watching her in silence. When Elise finished, Marta took the cup and turned away. Elise stood frozen, the echo of the noise from the hallway still ringing in her ears. That night, back in her small room, Elise sat on the edge of her narrow bed. She wrapped her shawl tighter, staring at the barred window and the black forest beyond. Somewhere inside the villa, something shifted and creaked in the darkness. Elise pressed her hands to her ears, as if she could block out the entire house. But in her heart she knew the walls had already started whispering, and she had no choice but to listen. Elise woke to the sound of soft, muffled footsteps outside her door. The pale dawn light had not yet touched the sky, and the room felt colder than before, as if the walls themselves exhaled frost during the night. She dressed quickly, her hands fumbling with the thin fabric of her dress. Her breath shivered in the air as she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. When she stepped into the hallway, she found Marta waiting. The old woman's eyes darted toward Elise's face, then down to the floor. Without a word, she turned and began walking toward the kitchen. Elise followed, her heartbeat echoing in her head. In the kitchen, the same silent routine began. Marta slid a pile of potatoes across the table and handed Elise a small, worn knife. The cold metal felt heavy and foreign in her fingers. They worked side by side. Marta's movements were smooth and mechanical, her eyes fixed on the table. Elise dared a glance at her from time to time, trying to read something, anything, in her hollow gaze. Outside the small kitchen window, a thin fog clung to the courtyard, curling around the bare trees like pale fingers. The world beyond felt unreachable, like a dream she had long forgotten. Once the vegetables were done, Marta pointed toward the hallway with a stiff gesture. Elise carried a heavy bucket of peelings out the back door and into the courtyard. The air bit at her cheeks, and she felt a sudden urge to run, anywhere, just away. But her feet refused to move beyond the narrow path. On her way back inside, she paused at the threshold. From somewhere deeper in the villa, she heard the faint murmur of voices. One was a thin, trembling whisper, the widow's, she guessed. The other was Mr. Harrow's, low and sharp like a blade drawn slowly across glass. She strained to catch the words, but they blurred into an angry, cold rhythm that made her stomach tighten. Stepping carefully, Elise crept a few paces toward the sound, her breath shallow. She pressed her back against the wall, inching closer to a half-open door. Through the crack, she saw Mr. Harrow standing close to a large armchair. A frail figure sat hunched in it, the widow. The old woman's face was hidden beneath a dark lace veil. Her thin hands trembled in her lap, fingers moving restlessly as though picking at invisible threads. Mr. Harrow leaned over her, whispering urgently. Though Elise couldn't hear the words, the menace in his posture was unmistakable. The widow flinched with each syllable, shrinking deeper into the chair. Suddenly, Mr. Harrow turned his head sharply. Elise's heart seized. She backed away from the door, nearly stumbling over a loose floorboard. She caught herself just in time and hurried down the hallway, forcing her breaths to stay silent. Back in the kitchen, Marta glanced at her, eyes narrowing for a split second before returning to the stove. Elise sank onto the small stool in the corner, her hands trembling in her lap. The image of the veiled widow and Mr. Harrow's dark figure burned behind her eyes. She felt as if the house itself had shown her a secret it didn't mean to reveal. For the first time, she wondered if there had ever been a true choice, or if from the moment she crossed the threshold, her fate had already been sealed. That evening, Elise sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her thin shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Outside the barred window, the forest had become an indistinguishable black wall, the fog weaving between the trees like silent ghosts. She replayed the scene from the hallway over and over in her mind. The old widow, shrinking under Mr. Harrow's sharp whispers, his hand clenched around the back of her chair. A cold shiver crawled up Elise's spine each time she pictured it. She stood and approached the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. The forest felt so close, yet impossibly far. She thought of her aunt's letter, the final words before she left. "Stay quiet. Return when you can." But now she saw the truth. There was no returning, no quiet that would ever be enough. A sudden knock at the door jolted her back. Before she could answer, Marta entered. She carried a small lantern, the weak flame flickering wildly in the draught. Her eyes flicked to Elise, then to the floor. Marta placed a tray on the small chair, a bowl of thin soup and a crust of bread. Elise nodded in silent thanks, but Marta didn't meet her gaze. Instead, she lingered by the door, her fingers twisting in her apron. After a tense pause, Marta took one cautious step forward. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Elise's heart jumped. She stared at Marta, waiting, pleading silently for her to continue. Marta opened her mouth again, but a sudden noise in the hallway, a sharp creak, made her flinch violently. Without a word, she turned and slipped out, shutting the door quickly behind her. Elise stood frozen. The tray trembled in her hands as she set it on the windowsill. Her appetite vanished, her stomach clenched into a tight knot. She moved to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. The hallway beyond was silent now, but she could almost feel Mr. Harrow's presence lurking just beyond the edges of her hearing. Elise turned back to her bed and sat down heavily. Her eyes fell on the soup, the thin film of oil reflecting the flickering lantern light. The warmth of the room felt like a trap, as if the walls themselves breathed slowly around her, waiting for her to make a single wrong move. She thought of Marta's unfinished words. There had been something there, a warning, a plea, but fear had strangled it before it could be born. Elise curled under the blanket, fully dressed, her shawl still tight around her neck. Sleep hovered just beyond reach, each sound from the hallway jolting her closer to full waking terror. In the darkness, the house seemed to settle deeper into its secrets, and Elise understood with a clarity sharp enough to cut. Silence here was not safety. It was surrender. Elise did not remember falling asleep, but she woke to the sharp crack of something striking the floor outside her door. Her eyes snapped open. The pale, thin morning light barely reached across the room, and her breath already felt tight in her chest. She sat up slowly, listening. Another noise, a slow, dragging sound in the hallway, then silence. Elise rose and crept to the door. She pressed her ear against the wood, straining to catch any hint of movement. The house beyond seemed to hold its breath. With careful fingers, she unlatched the door and pulled it open a crack. The hallway stretched before her, empty but heavy with tension. Something small and dark lay on the floor a few steps away. She stepped out cautiously and bent down. It was a folded piece of yellowed paper, edges frayed. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up and unfolded it. The writing was rough, hurried, almost frantic. A single line. "They do not let you leave. You must not trust him." Elise's heart crashed into her ribs. She glanced down the hallway, but no one appeared. The paper felt like a burning coal in her hand. She slipped it into her sleeve and hurried back into her room, closing the door as quietly as she could. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. She sat on the bed, unfolding the note again and again as if expecting more words to appear, but it remained just that single desperate warning. A sharp knock at the door made her jump, crumpling the note into her palm. Before she could hide it, the door swung open. Mr. Harrow stood there, his dark coat immaculate, his eyes sweeping the room with cold precision. He stepped inside without waiting for permission. His gaze settled on her, then slid down to her clenched fist. "What is that?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, like a blade drawn across stone. Elise shook her head, her lips parting but no words coming out. Mr. Harrow's face tightened. In 2 steps he was in front of her, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist. His fingers closed like iron around her bones. She tried to pull away, but he pried her fingers open with cruel patience. The crumpled note fell to the floor between them. For a moment silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Then he bent slowly, picked up the paper and read it. His expression did not change, but a vein in his neck pulsed visibly. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. Then he looked at her again, his eyes sharp enough to pierce straight through her. "You will stay in your room today," he said softly. "You will not speak to Marta. You will not leave. Is that understood?" Elise could only nod, her throat tight with terror. Mr. Harrow released her wrist, turned, and left the room. The door closed with a quiet finality that felt louder than any scream. Elise stood in the center of the room, her hand still frozen in the shape of his grip. She felt the weight of the warning pressed into her skin, even as the paper itself was gone. She understood now. This was not a house of service or duty. It was a cage, one carefully built, silently maintained, and guarded by eyes that never truly closed. Elise spent the entire day locked in her room, pacing between the narrow bed and the small barred window. The hours stretched endlessly, each minute gnawing at her mind like a silent, patient moth. She tried to peer outside, but the fog was too thick. Only the vague outlines of the nearest trees showed through, shifting and blending like pale ghosts. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her breath clouding in front of her eyes. In the hallway she heard occasional movements, the creak of floorboards, the soft clink of keys, and once the faint sound of Marta's cautious steps. Each noise made Elise freeze, her hands clenched at her sides. By evening, a sharp knock broke the suffocating silence. She spun around just as the door opened a few inches. Marta's face appeared in the gap, eyes darting nervously over her shoulder before settling on Elise. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Marta slipped inside, closing the door quickly behind her. Her thin hands trembled as she stepped forward, her lips pressed tightly together. Elise stared at her, desperate to speak but afraid to make a sound. Marta reached into her apron and pulled out a small object, a rusted iron key. She held it out, her fingers shaking violently. Elise's eyes widened. She hesitated, then stepped forward and took the key. It was cold and heavy in her palm, the rough metal biting into her skin. Marta grabbed Elise's hand suddenly, squeezing it so hard it hurt. Her mouth opened, but the words came out only as a ragged whisper. "You must leave, tonight. He will not wait anymore." Elise's heart thundered. She searched Marta's face, saw the terror carved into every line, every hollow space beneath her eyes. Marta's grip loosened, and she backed away, her shoulders curling inward as though she might collapse. She turned to the door, hesitated, then looked back once more, her eyes full of a silent, pleading urgency, before slipping into the hallway and disappearing. Elise stood frozen, staring at the key. Her mind spun in sharp, broken fragments. Tonight. He will not wait. Tonight. She tucked the key beneath her shawl, pressing it against her pounding heart. Her gaze shifted to the window again. Beyond the fog, the forest waited, dark and unknowable, but freer than the walls pressing in on her now. She turned and began to gather what little she had, the thin shawl, her small book of poems, her aunt's letter. Each item felt insignificant, yet each was a lifeline to the world she had almost forgotten. As the last light faded from the sky, Elise sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers tight around the key. The floor creaked softly beyond her door, as if the house itself were listening. She knew now there would be no second chance. Tonight, she would either slip beyond the gate or disappear into the same shadows that had swallowed every girl before her. Elise waited until the house fell into its deep, oppressive quiet. The last faint echo of footsteps faded, and the oil lamps in the hallway burned low, casting long, weak shadows that shivered with each draft. She rose from the bed, her hands trembling as she clutched the rusted key beneath her shawl. Each breath felt too loud, as if it might betray her before she even reached the door. Carefully, she opened her small bundle. The thin shawl, her book of poems, the letter from her aunt. She tucked them close to her body, as though they might steady her shaking heart. She moved to the door and pressed her ear against it. Silence. With careful fingers, she turned the latch and slipped into the hallway. The portraits along the walls loomed in the darkness, their painted eyes seeming to watch each hesitant step. Elise's feet glided across the cold floor, her entire body coiled tight, ready to break into a run at the smallest noise. She reached the main staircase and paused at the top. Below, the entrance hall stretched wide and dim, the moonlight barely catching on the marble tiles. The east wing door stood closed, but a thin line of light glowed beneath it, as if someone waited inside. Elise forced her gaze away, focusing on the narrow corridor leading to the servants' passage. Marta had once whispered about it during a rare moment of fragile courage. A hidden path behind the pantry that led to the side garden and the outer gate. Elise moved quickly now, her fingers brushing the walls for balance. She found the small wooden door at the far end of the pantry. It creaked faintly as she pushed it open, and she froze, breath caught in her throat. Nothing, only the groan of old wood. Beyond the door, the passage was narrow and damp, the walls close enough to scrape her shoulders. She slipped inside, closing the door gently behind her. The darkness pressed against her face like a wet cloth. She reached out carefully, finding the rough edge of the wall to guide her steps. The key felt heavy in her pocket, every movement making it scrape softly against the fabric. After what felt like an eternity, a faint draft brushed across her face. She quickened her steps, heart thundering as the air turned colder. Finally, she saw it, a sliver of moonlight breaking through the cracks of the side gate. The faint smell of wet earth and pine drifted in, so sharp and alive it made her dizzy. Elise reached the iron gate and pulled the key from her pocket, her fingers slick with sweat. She forced it into the rusted lock, twisting slowly. The mechanism groaned in protest. Elise bit her lip, fighting the urge to sob. She turned the key again, harder this time. A loud, echoing click rang out, cutting through the passage like a scream. She froze, her ears straining. A distant creak, a door, heavy footsteps. Panic surged through her veins like fire. She pushed against the gate, her shoulders heaving. It moved slowly, sticky with years of neglect. Behind her, she heard his voice, low, sharp, cutting through the dark. "Elise!" She shoved the gate open wide enough to slip through. The cold night air hit her face like a slap, and she stumbled out into the garden, her feet sliding on the wet stones. She did not look back. The forest loomed ahead, black and endless. Without thinking, she plunged forward, her heart screaming the only word left inside her, "Run!" Elise tore across the garden, her feet slipping on wet grass and moss-covered stones. Branches whipped at her arms and face, slicing her skin in thin, stinging lines. Her breath came in ragged bursts, each one sharper than the last. Behind her, she heard him. Mr. Harrow's heavy boots pounding across the courtyard, the low, furious echo of her name tearing through the fog. She reached the edge of the garden where the forest loomed like a wall of black water. Without hesitating, she plunged into it, the cold, wet earth sucking at her shoes. The trees closed around her instantly, their trunks looming like silent sentinels. The fog thickened, wrapping around her face and neck like a shroud. Elise clawed her way forward, her hands catching on slick bark and thorny underbrush. Somewhere behind her, branches snapped and leaves crunched underfoot. His voice rose again, closer this time, slicing through the darkness. "Elise, stop!" She stumbled over a root, crashing to the ground. Mud soaked through her dress, seeping into her skin. She pushed herself up with shaking arms, her palms raw and burning. In the moonlight, she saw a narrow deer trail twisting deeper into the trees. She scrambled toward it, fighting to stay upright, her breath loud enough she feared it would lead him straight to her. Elise ducked beneath a low branch, her shoulder catching and tearing her sleeve. Blood trickled down her arm, but she hardly felt it. Every nerve was fixed on the sounds behind her, his steps growing louder, steadier. She reached a small clearing and froze. In the center, a dark pool reflected the pale moonlight. The water was still, almost unnaturally so, and for a split second she saw her own face staring back, wide-eyed, mouth open in silent terror. A crash behind her snapped her head around. Mr. Harrow stood at the edge of the clearing, his dark coat blending with the trees, his eyes locked on her like iron hooks. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other, the world around them shrinking to a single pulsing moment. Then he stepped forward. Elise spun and fled around the pool, her feet slipping on the wet moss. Her lungs screamed, her vision blurred. She heard him give chase, felt the ground tremble beneath his weight. She ran until her legs buckled, her body crashing through a thicket. She crawled forward, grabbing handfuls of wet leaves and dirt to pull herself beyond reach. At last, she saw another narrow trail, half hidden by fallen branches. She threw herself onto it, forcing her aching body forward. Behind her, Mr. Harrow's steps slowed. His angry shouts turned to low curses, echoing through the trees. Elise dared one look back and saw him at the edge of the trail, scanning the dark, breathing heavily. She pressed onward, her fingers gripping the muddy earth. Somewhere deep inside, the smallest spark of hope flickered, fragile but alive. She had slipped his grasp for now, but she knew the night was far from over, and he was not finished hunting. Elise dragged herself along the narrow trail, her breath tearing through her chest like shards of glass. Her hair clung to her face in wet strands, her dress heavy with mud and blood. She paused for a moment, collapsing against the base of a thick pine. The rough bark scraped her back, but she welcomed the sting. It meant she was still alive. Above, the moon slipped in and out of the clouds, throwing pale flashes of light across the forest floor. Each time it reappeared, Elise could see just far enough ahead to keep moving. She listened, straining to hear any sound over her own labored gasps. A faint wind stirred the branches, but deeper down the path the night was silent. No echo of boots, no angry voice calling her name. Elise forced herself up again. Every part of her body screamed in protest, but she pressed on, stumbling over roots and fallen branches. Her hands were raw and shaking, her knees cut and bruised. She kept replaying Marta's voice in her head. "You must leave tonight. He will not wait any more." Suddenly the trail curved sharply and opened into another small clearing. In its center stood a half-rotted wooden shrine, almost swallowed by moss and ivy. The sight stopped her cold. She stumbled forward, drawn to it by some silent pull. Inside the shrine, a small candle sat, melted nearly to nothing. Around it, scraps of cloth, ribbons, torn sleeves, lay folded carefully as if offered in desperation. Elise reached out and touched one of the ribbons, her fingers trembling. It felt damp and fragile, the fabric falling apart beneath her touch. A sudden snap behind her made her spin around, heart crashing in her chest. In the shadows beyond the clearing, she saw movement, the faint outline of Mr. Harrow's dark figure slipping between the trees. Panic roared through her veins. She dropped the ribbon and bolted across the clearing, not caring where the next path led. Her vision blurred with tears and moonlight as branches clawed at her face. She heard him calling, closer now, his voice twisted through the fog. "Come back, Elise. This is pointless." She pushed harder, the forest narrowing around her like a closing fist. She tripped, fell into a shallow ditch, and scrambled out again, her hands coated in mud. Somewhere in the darkness, she saw a glimmer, a broken fence post, just beyond the last line of pines. Beyond it, the ground dipped sharply downward, leading toward an unseen valley. Elise ran for it, her entire body burning. Behind her, Mr. Harrow crashed through the underbrush, closer and closer. She threw herself over the broken fence, tumbling down the slope on the other side. Rocks and branches tore at her skin as she slid, unable to stop herself. At the bottom she landed hard, her breath knocked from her lungs. For a moment she lay still, staring up at the star-flecked sky. Then she heard him above, cursing, searching. She forced herself onto her hands and knees, crawling forward, inch by inch. At the edge of the valley she saw it, a faint, flickering light far in the distance. A lantern, perhaps, or a farmhouse window. Elise pressed her forehead to the cold earth, tears mixing with the mud beneath her. She pulled herself up again, pushing toward that distant glow with the last strength she had left. Elise staggered forward, her entire body trembling. The cold wind sliced through her torn dress, biting deep into her raw skin. Each step felt heavier than the last, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. Behind her, the forest loomed, a black, silent mass swallowing every trace of her passage. Each time she glanced back, she imagined Mr. Harrow stepping out of the shadows, his pale face emerging in the moonlight. But for now, there was only silence. She turned her gaze ahead. The faint light she had seen earlier wavered on the horizon, sometimes disappearing behind the mist. She focused on it like a single point of salvation, forcing her feet to move. As she stumbled down the narrow valley path, she felt her fingers brush against a row of old, broken fence posts, half buried in the frozen ground. She grabbed one for support, her breath tearing out of her throat in sharp, jagged sobs. She pressed her forehead against the wood, trying to steady herself. Her mind flickered back to the villa. Marta's hollow eyes, the widow's trembling hands under the veil, the echo of Mr. Harrow's voice in the dark halls. A wave of nausea rose in her chest. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself upright again. When she looked ahead once more, she saw a small shape moving near the light. A figure, hunched and slow, carrying a lantern. Elise's heart surged with wild, fragile hope. She stepped forward, raising her arm weakly. "Please!" she tried to call out, but her voice cracked, coming out as a rough whisper. The figure paused, turning slowly. The lantern light caught a man's lined face, an old farmer wrapped in a heavy coat, his eyes wide with surprise. Elise stumbled forward again, her knees buckling. The man rushed toward her, his boots crunching over the frost-covered ground. He caught her just as she collapsed, his strong, calloused hands holding her upright. "God above, girl, what happened to you?" he murmured, his voice rough with shock. Elise clutched at his coat, her words tumbling out in broken fragments. "Please, help! He's coming! Don't let him take me back!" The man glanced behind her, scanning the dark edge of the forest. Then he wrapped one arm firmly around her shoulders, turning her toward the distant farmhouse. "Come quickly," he said, his voice firm now. "You're safe with me." Elise let him guide her, her legs moving like they belonged to someone else. Each step felt impossibly heavy, but the warmth of his grip anchored her, pulling her through the freezing air. She glanced back once more. The trees stood silent, the mist curling between their trunks like pale smoke. No figure appeared. No echo of her name drifted out. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Elise allowed her head to drop against someone's shoulder, her tears falling freely. She had not yet escaped the darkness inside her, but she had left the villa behind, and tonight that was enough to keep her moving forward. The farmer half-carried Elise up a narrow, frozen path toward the small farmhouse. The lantern swung wildly in his free hand, throwing jagged shadows across the ground. Elise's feet dragged through the dirt, her head lolling against his shoulder. When they reached the door, he kicked it open with a sharp thud. Warm air rushed out to meet them, thick with the smell of smoke and old wood. Elise inhaled sharply, the sudden heat burning her lungs. Inside, the farmer guided her to a rough wooden bench near the hearth. A fire crackled weakly, and a pot of water steamed above it. He set her down gently, then crouched in front of her, his hands hovering uncertainly at her arms. "Stay here, girl," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I'll fetch some blankets." Elise nodded, her head dropping forward. Her fingers dug into the edge of the bench as she shivered violently, the sudden warmth making her cuts and bruises ache all at once. The farmer returned quickly, draping a thick wool blanket around her shoulders. Elise clutched it close, burying her face in its coarse folds. He moved to the fire, stoking it higher, then poured a ladle of steaming water into a chipped cup. He pressed it into her hands, guiding her fingers around it until she could grip it herself. She tried to speak, but her throat felt raw and tight. Only a strangled croak came out. The farmer sat across from her, watching carefully. His lined face looked even older in the flickering firelight, his eyes dark with worry. "Who did this to you?" he asked finally, his voice almost a whisper. Elise shook her head, her tears soaking into the blanket. She thought of Mr. Harrow's cold eyes, the silent portraits in the hallway, the widow's trembling hands beneath the veil, all of it pressed against her chest like a stone. The farmer didn't press her. Instead, he leaned forward, setting a hand on her knee. "You're safe here. No one comes this far without my knowing," he said firmly. Elise looked up at him, her lips parting but no words formed. Only more tears fell, her shoulders shaking under the blanket. He stood and moved to the window, peering into the night. He stayed there a long moment, the lantern light catching the side of his face. When he turned back, he nodded to himself as if making a silent promise. "Rest now," he said. "You'll need your strength come morning." Elise curled into the bench, the blanket pulled tight around her chin. Her eyelids drooped heavily, exhaustion dragging her down. For the first time in what felt like centuries, she let herself lean fully into the warmth, the smell of smoke and wool wrapping around her like a fragile shield. Even as her mind whispered warnings, even as the shadows of the villa clung to the edges of her thoughts, she felt her body slip into sleep. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but inside, the fire cracked and the old man stood watch. Elise did not know what would come next, whether safety or another chase. But in that moment, in that small room, she was no longer running. Elise woke to the pale gray light of early dawn seeping through the small window above the hearth. The blanket had slipped to the floor, and her limbs felt heavy, as if filled with wet sand. The old farmer sat by the fire, his head bowed, hands clasped loosely between his knees. He looked up when he heard her stir, his eyes sharp and searching. "You slept," he said softly. "That's good." Elise sat up slowly, wincing as the aches in her muscles flared to life. Her throat felt dry, her lips cracked. She looked at him, then at the small wooden cup beside her on the bench. She reached for it, her hands shaking. The water tasted metallic but cool. It slid down her throat like a promise she didn't dare believe. The farmer shifted closer. "I checked the woods before sunrise," he said. "No tracks, no sign of him." Elise's eyes darted to the window. The thought of Mr. Harrow, his black coat, the way his voice cut through the dark, made her stomach tighten. The farmer followed her gaze. "Whoever he was, he didn't come near here, and if he does, I'll know." Elise nodded weakly, her fingers curling around the empty cup. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat, tangled and useless. Seeing her struggle, the farmer leaned forward, his voice softer now. "You don't have to tell me," he said. "Not now. Maybe not ever. But you should eat something. You need your strength." He stood and moved to the hearth, ladling porridge into a small wooden bowl. The smell, warm oats, honey, drifted through the room. Elise felt an unexpected rush of tears sting her eyes. When he handed her the bowl, her fingers brushed against his. For a moment, she felt something she had not felt in weeks, human warmth without threat. She ate slowly, each spoonful a small act of survival. The farmer watched quietly, his eyes studying her as though measuring how much spirit remained inside her battered frame. When she finished, she set the bowl aside and looked at him directly for the first time. Her voice came out in a thin whisper, nearly lost in the crackle of the fire. "Thank you." The farmer dipped his head slightly. "You'll stay here today," he said. "Rest. Tonight, if you're strong enough, I'll take you to the village, the sisters at the monastery. They'll know what to do." A spark of relief and fear flickered inside Elise. The idea of moving again, of leaving even this small shelter, made her pulse race. But staying was impossible. She knew Mr. Harrow would never stop searching. She looked down at her hands, the cuts and bruises, the dirt under her nails. Then she nodded, a single sharp movement that felt like a vow. The farmer stood and moved to the window once more, checking the tree line as the fog began to lift. Elise leaned back, exhaustion washing over her again. She closed her eyes briefly, seeing not the forest or the moonlit trail, but the narrow halls of the villa, the locked doors, Marta's trembling hands, the cold eyes in the dark. She opened her eyes again, forcing her breath to steady. Today she had a chance. Tonight she would try. For the first time in many nights, the whisper of possibility, small and fragile, curled inside her ribs like a hidden ember. The day passed in a heavy, hushed blur. Elise sat by the fire, wrapped in a thicker wool blanket the farmer had given her. Every few hours he brought her tea or a small piece of bread, urging her to eat even when her hands shook too badly to hold the cup steady. Outside, the gray morning turned into a wet, colorless afternoon. Mist clung to the valley, swallowing the fields and blurring the line where the forest began. Every time Elise looked out the small window, her breath caught, half expecting to see a dark figure standing at the edge of the trees. The farmer moved quietly around the small house, checking the locks on the doors, stepping outside occasionally to scan the paths. When he returned, he would give her a nod. No words, but enough to say, "Still safe." Elise spent most of the day clutching the edge of her blanket, her mind drifting in and out of sharp, jarring flashes. Marta's pale face, the cold hallway with its watching portraits, the rusted key in her hand, the echo of Mr. Harrow's voice slicing through the fog. By evening, the farmer crouched by the hearth again. He placed another small bowl of broth in front of her and waited until she had finished each slow, hesitant spoonful. When she finally set the empty bowl aside, he met her eyes directly. His voice was steady, low. "Tonight we move. The sisters at the monastery, they're good women. They'll hide you, keep you safe. You must keep quiet, keep close." Elise nodded, her throat dry. Her fingers curled into the blanket, knuckles white. She swallowed hard and forced herself to speak, her voice a thin thread. He'll come. He always finds them." The farmer leaned forward, his rough hand covering hers gently. "Not tonight," he said, his voice firm as though he could shape reality with the words alone. "I know these woods better than any man alive. We'll make it." A tear slipped down Elise's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Outside, the last light died slowly, smudging the valley into a deep, bruised blue. The farmer stood and pulled on a thick coat, then handed her a small shawl, heavier and warmer than her own. Elise wrapped it around her shoulders, the wool scratchy but comforting. She rose unsteadily, her knees trembling beneath her. At the door, the farmer paused and looked back at her. His eyes seemed to weigh her spirit one last time, searching for the last flicker of strength. Satisfied, he nodded once. He pushed the door open. The night air rushed in, sharp and cold, filling the small room like a warning. Elise stepped out after him, the darkness closing instantly around her. They moved together into the night, slipping down a narrow path between broken fence posts and overgrown brambles. Each step felt impossibly loud in her ears, but the farmer moved like a shadow, guiding her forward with a steady, silent confidence. When she glanced back, the farmhouse was already gone, swallowed by mist and darkness. Ahead, the forest loomed again. But this time it was not a prison. It was a passage. Elise pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the fragile beat beneath her palm. She didn't know what waited beyond the trees or at the monastery, but tonight, for the first time, she wasn't alone. They moved through the night, the farmer leading, Elise stumbling close behind. The narrow forest path twisted endlessly, branches snagging at her shawl, roots rising like black bones beneath her feet. Every few steps, she glanced over her shoulder, certain she would see Mr. Harrow's pale face between the trees, his hand reaching for her in the fog. But there was only the dark and the soft crunch of the farmer's boots ahead. The moon slipped in and out of clouds above, revealing glimpses of their breath rising like ghosts in the frozen air. Elise pressed the shawl tighter around her shoulders, her teeth chattering, her fingers stiff and useless. At last, the forest began to thin. Through the tangle of branches, she saw a faint glow ahead, soft golden light spilling from narrow windows. A bell tower rose above the trees, pale and silent under the moon. The monastery. Her knees weakened at the sight, and she stumbled. The farmer turned, catching her arm before she fell. His rough hand closed firmly around her wrist, pulling her upright. "Almost there," he whispered. "Just a few more steps." She nodded, tears springing hot and sudden to her eyes. Together they moved forward, breaking free from the last line of trees. As they crossed the open clearing, a heavy wooden door opened slowly. A nun stood in the doorway, her face lit by a lantern, her eyes widening at the sight of them. She stepped forward quickly, her skirts brushing the frost. The farmer guided Elise to the steps. The nun reached out, cradling Elise's face in warm, careful hands. "Child, dear God, what have they done to you?" she breathed, her voice breaking. Elise tried to answer, but only a choked sob escaped. The nun pulled her close, folding her into the warmth of her cloak. The farmer spoke quietly to the nun, his voice low and urgent. Elise could barely hear the words, her mind floating above her own shaking body. She felt hands guiding her inside, the lantern glow closing around her like a cocoon. The heavy door shut behind them, muting the world outside. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax and old stone. Candle flames flickered along the walls, and far down the corridor, a small group of sisters waited, their eyes full of shock and quiet compassion. Elise's legs gave out completely. The nun held her firmly, lowering her onto a narrow bench. Another sister brought a basin of warm water and a clean cloth, while another knelt to unlace her torn shoes. Through her tears, Elise watched them work, their movements gentle and practiced. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt safe. Not free. Not yet. The villa and its shadows still clung to her skin, to the hollow of her bones. She knew the nightmares would come, that Mr. Harrow's voice would echo in the dark corners of her mind for years to come. But as the nuns worked, she closed her eyes and let her head fall forward. The warmth, the quiet hands, the low murmur of prayer, all of it wove around her like a fragile promise. She had crossed the threshold, she had been seen, saved, and tonight, for the first time, she allowed herself to believe in something she had not dared to hold on to for so long, tomorrow.